Hey, so nice to see y'all again. Welcome back. This is our second half of class, and as such is going to be a huge change. So up to this point, we've been talking about poems and poetry. We are going to switch gears entirely and start talking about fiction and specifically short stories to a great degree. I love stories, and one of the reasons I love them is the way that they're so deeply entwined with human experience. We tell stories from almost birth, right? How young does a child have to be before they can start telling you what's happened to them? Start telling you stories about their life, etc. Furthermore, think about the fact that story is constantly part of your day. Almost from the moment you wake up till the moment you go to sleep. You could consider all of that as we experience life in terms of story, right? When people tell you what happened, it's always beginning, middle, end, right? We're always telling a story and trying to make it more interesting, right? Even when you're telling someone about your day, you're really often trying to make it as fascinating for them as possible. And of course, when we go to sleep at night, what happens? Well, our brains continue to tell us stories until we wake back up, and we call those dreams. So, a lot of human experience is filtered through this idea of story or narrative, which I think is really interesting. Incidentally, the word story can mean so many different things, and I'm going to use it in so many different ways that I'm not going to put it on your test as something you have to define because it's a little too vague and all over the placey. And in general, the question, what is a story, is one of those deep philosophical ones to which there's not one specific answer. So, you don't have to worry about writing that down or putting it on your terms check. But what I do want you to think about in those specific terms are ideas that help us break open stories. So when we talked about poetry, we talked a lot about the different poetic techniques that help us understand what a writer might be up to at a given time. That is even more the case when we are discussing fiction. There are things that we need to be thinking about to help us understand the deeper meaning behind stories. And that is an important thing to think about, right? Because stories are often going to have, or always going to have, almost always, a really surface level, right? It's very easy to give a straightforward anecdotal reading. Well, this happens, this happens, this happens. But it's not necessarily what happens in a story. It's what those actions are meant to entail to some degree or another, maybe. So, the first terms that I want us to work on and define in order to make sure we're all on the same page, is the idea of genre. So, genre, this is a term you'll need for your test, G-E-N-R-E, is a class of art characterized by similarities in form, style, theme, or trope. Those last two words are ones I want to tarry on themselves. So just once again, though, before we move forward. So genre is any class of story that you can say shares theme, subject matter, style, form, any of the above can be defined as the defining characteristics of genre. But one of the most important defining characteristics are the repetitive use of tropes. So a trope is a motif within a story, or something that is repeated often. Let me get a little more. So trope, first off, let me spell it. T-R-O-P-E can be defined as a significant or recurring theme in multiple stories. So it's something that happens a lot given a given genre. Let me back up and sort of give some examples, see if that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about horror movies as our genre. Horror is a genre, right? It fits our things. It is a class of art that shares subject material, theme, and also a lot of tropes, which means that they all do a lot of the same moves in a lot of ways, right? Think of like 10 horror movies. If you want, you could actually list them out, and I'll give you a second, and maybe you can pause the video if you're really into that. Now, how many of those horror movies that you're thinking of right now include a scene where the main characters are warned about what might happen to them, right? Where there's a scene where, like, some old dude, or maybe it's the police, stops them and says, oh, you shouldn't go up to that house on the corner, or there's the cabin in the woods is dangerous, etc., etc., etc. How many movies does that happen in? Dozens, right? What other tropes do horror movies have? Things that occur a lot in different horror movies. There's the scare scene where they're gonna jump out at you, right? There's the twist ending where you think the story's over, but it's really not, and then they're gonna come back one more time and get you, right? These are tropes of horror. And it's worth thinking about tropes for this specific reason. By thinking about the ways that a given story either fulfills or does not fulfill the tropes of the genre it seems to be related to, you can start getting at the deeper meaning of what the story itself is about. That is particularly the case with the story I'm asking you to read this week, which is called Standard Loneliness Package by Charles Yu. It's in your book this week. And the genre that I would define this is, and this is the last term I want you guys to make sure you're getting down for the week. So genre, trope, and this third term is speculative fiction. Speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is, first off, a genre defined by being set in the near future and using those futuristic elements to comment on contemporary society. So, in a lot of ways, you could call this sci-fi, but it's more specific than that because it has to be our relatively recent future, right? Connected to what's still going on in today's society. So, for instance, Star Trek, set 300 years in the future, some of the things that go on do reflect back on our society. But that society has changed so much and is so different from ours that you can't really call it a near future, right? It's so distant that so many things have changed that life is really changed in terms of context. The story you read this week, however, could be set today. If the technology that it mentions existed, there's nothing else about it that requires a futuristic tone, right? Society is still operating under mostly the same rules. Second part of that is the futuristic sci-fi elements have to help refer back to our current age. So if it's a story that includes futuristic elements, but those futuristic elements are just kind of fun or cool, so they just create sort of an interesting thing, like a action movie that includes a futuristic weapon that doesn't necessarily exist. Even if everything else about it was like our society, that might not be the same thing. So it might not qualify as speculative fiction simply because that's just there for fun. This story is most definitely an example of speculative fiction. Charles Yu's special Standard Loneliness Package, because it is set in the near future, right? The only thing that's different is this wild new technology that allows people to basically outsource the crappy parts of their life and pay someone else to experience the parts of their life that are so terrible that they would just rather sort of check out instead. And that idea refers back to our particular society in interesting, fascinating ways, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you 100% what it means, but here are some things to think about, right? What does it mean that we are willing to let people across oceans suffer for us? Obviously, this story puts it in a more concrete fashion, but to what degree is that already the case? That's one of the things they might be pointing out. Furthermore, the idea of living one's life in a machine. How often are we already doing that? How many of us can be said to have the job where we plug into a machine and suffer for other people for a given number of hours every day? And that's sort of our job, right? I know, messed up. So in this ways, the sci-fi futuristic elements refer back to the original refer back to our society and help sort of make a statement about us. So, one thing, when you recognize that a story may or may not be speculative fiction, and we're going to read a couple of stories that qualify therein, first question you ask yourself is, so, if this is speculative fiction, what is the new futuristic change, and what sort of a statement might the writer be making about contemporary society by including that? That's the first thing I want you to think about, right? And in so doing, we can start getting at the deeper meaning of this story and other stories in similar genres. Now, many stories, this one included, are part of more than one genre, or might be, depending on your definition thereof. For instance, is this also a love story? And I'm not going to spell out the tropes of love stories specifically. I'm going to leave that to you guys. But what does a love story include? What do love stories in general always have to do? How would you define the genre? What are the tropes that make you know that it's a love story? What do they have to have? Does this do all of that? Does it count in that degree? And so you might say that a love story has to include a happy ending. That's one of the things love stories often have, right? And that brings up the interesting question, does this story have an interesting ending? Or, does the story have a happy ending? Would you call that happiness? And it's sort of strange. I don't have an answer there, right? I won't put words into your head, but I will point out that even as dark and dismal as it is, those people found a real connection, right? They were really alive in that one moment. And how important is that? How valuable does that become, particularly considering all the other things that have happened in this particular story? So that's going to get us started and get us started moving in the right direction. Again, our 3 terms I want you to work on: genre, trope, and speculative fiction. That's what we're working on this week. Comments, questions, concerns, let me know. Otherwise, guys, thanks so much for all your hard work.